In this material, you will learn how to effectively use SNS. SNS, an exchange-type communication tool using the Internet, is used by many people because of its convenience. According to a survey by the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications, SNS users have various merits. For example, you can make new friends and counselors, strengthen ties with family and friends, connect with people you haven't contacted for a while, and get the latest information on social conditions and hobbies. However, people experience various troubles apart from the merits. Possible troubles when posting to SNS are that your remarks are received differently than your intention, that you argue with others, and write critically about your posted content from multiple people. It is possible that content, with the intention of making a light joke, will hurt others. In addition, posting on SNS may cause trouble such as leakage of personal information, disclosure of anonymity, or revealing oneself regardless of one's intention. You may feel psychological stress by browsing SNS. For example, when I see a friend's post, I feel self-doubt. Additionally, I get anxiety when I leave messages on read, such as I marked it as read, but I don't know what to reply to it, and even if there is a read mark, there is no reply from the other party. In addition, you may be worried about the reaction of others, such as likes, or you may be upset thinking that you may have been left out. As you can see, SNS is a useful tool, but due to various factors, the use of SNS itself can be a burden on your mind. This is called social networking fatigue. You may have felt it too. So what can we do to prevent and not feel social networking fatigue? First of all, when posting to SNS, it is important to stop and reflect on the contents before pressing the send button. Consider any problems with posting your content from the perspective of others and not just yourself. Is it possible that you or someone else will be identified? Is it possible that you or someone else will be identified? Did you get permission to post the photos? Isn't it used to just spread rumors and uncertain information? Be careful about these things not only when you post but also when you share and spread. It is important not to believe everything on SNS as they are, but to think calmly and carefully for yourself. When browsing SNS, it is important to use it as much as you can enjoy. First, don't ask for too many likes. There is a limit to how much you can control whether or not you can get likes on SNS, so you may become more dependent on others, which is a point to note when using SNS. It is important to use it as much as you can enjoy. And if you are worried about what to reply after marking the other party's message as read, one method is not to force a reply. It is also necessary to make a calm judgment without trusting the information written on SNS as they are. By being calm and thinking about the situation, context, and background of the other person, you may be able to prevent yourself from being upset by looking at someone's post. You can also adjust the settings of SNS and the smartphone itself. In many SNS, you can set the disclosure range. You can share memories and events without it being seen by strangers. However, even if you have set the disclosure range, you still have to think twice about the content before posting. If you are too concerned about SNS, you may consider limiting the usage time. You can reduce the time you spend on SNS by using the settings of your smartphone and the application that controls the usage time. SNS is a convenient and fun service, and it is becoming an indispensable part of our lives in modern society. However, in the world of the Internet, we are exposed to various people all over the world, and unexpected troubles may occur. In order not to feel social networking fatigue, you may want to stop and think about your own SNS usage. Let's enjoy using SNS with the above factors in mind.